Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue our exploration of multiple sclerosis. Today, I will be discussing the patient perspective of MS with Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, who narrated his experience in his illness memoir titled Metamorphosis, A Life in Pieces. This was published by Vintage in 2023 and was described by the Spectator magazine as immensely powerful. Robert Douglas-Fairhurst is a professor of English literature and a fellow of Magdalen College in Oxford. Apart from Metamorphosis, his other books include Becoming Dickens, which was awarded the Duff Cooper Prize, The Story of Alice, which was shortlisted for the Costa Prize, and The Turning Point. He writes regularly for publications including The Times, Spectator, and The Literary Review. He also appears in radio and television programs, including Start the Week, the Today program, BBC Breakfast, and The Culture Show. Robert Douglas-Fairhurst has acted as the historical consultant on BBC productions of Jane Eyre, Emma, Great Expectations, and Dickensian, as well as both of the Enola Holmes films for Netflix. And he has judged the Man Booker Prize and the Baillie Gifford Prize. And to top it off, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2015. Robert, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to participate in this podcast. I'm most grateful indeed for your time.
Not at all. It's good to be here with you all.
Thank you. My usual first question for my guests is, why did you write the book, especially as it kind of brings out some negative things in terms of illness?
Yeah, and I'm sure there's an element of therapy in it, as there often is when anyone writes any kind of memoir. And when I say that, I'm conscious of the fact that often we make sense out of our own experiences by making up sentences about it, that often simply trying to narrate an idea is to try to give it some kind of shape or coherence. However, I do hope that it wasn't entirely selfish as an impulse. One of the things about multiple sclerosis, as many of your listeners will already be aware of, is that it can be an invisible disease until the symptoms become very obvious. It's also largely an inaudible disease in the sense that, unlike, say, certain forms of cancer, or more recently, other neurological disorders like motor neuron disease, it really doesn't attract that much attention in the media, or even, dare I say it, in terms of research funding. So that's another reason why I wanted to write this book, to try to raise people's awareness of a disease which they might have heard of but didn't otherwise know much about. And the reason for doing that, I suppose, is that, like a lot of other neurological disorders, MS isn't only a problem for the person who has it, it's a problem for everyone else as well. And so for everyone to know a little bit more about it is where altruism and self-interest might come together. So it's a sort of tissue of reasons for writing the book, but I hope selfishness wasn't the only one.
So does that assume that you knew very little about it before you got the disease itself?
Absolutely. Like a lot of people, for me, it was a series of fragments of movies and memories of famous people who I knew had suffered from MS. I suppose because I was a cellist when I was younger, then the fact that Jacqueline Dupre, the cellist, I knew had suffered from it and had to give up her career as a cellist because of an aggressive form of MS. Meant that it had always been somewhere bubbling at the back of my mind, but it never really thrust itself to the forefront until it had to.
And how did you go about writing it? In the sense, is it you took time off, or you wrote it as you were recovering, or what was the?
No, so the first thing I did actually was I got myself a notebook, and quite soon after I was diagnosed, I started writing diary entries. The book was a kind of blood red notebook I call The Patient, which was mostly because that's what I now was in the eyes of the medical profession. I was the patient, asking difficult questions and trying to make sense of things. but also because that's what MS requires above all else. It requires patience. Patience in terms of trying to work out how things are going to develop, patience in terms of waiting for something that may or may not help, patience in terms of just sort of proceeding along the path of degeneration in my case, and seeing what's going to come next. And so having written a lot of these diary entries, I then decided to try and piece them together, piece the fragments into some kind of jigsaw puzzle of a story. And then I decided to bring in someone else's story as a model or a counterweight to my own. And that's when I discovered the naturalist Bruce Cummings, who published under the pen name Barbellion, WPN Barbellion, who wrote a book called A Diary of a Disappointed Man, published more than 100 years ago now, in which he talked about his own experiences of an aggressive form of MS that killed him before he was 30.
That's the long view. Okay, coming back to the onset of your symptoms, I mean, from what I can see, the first episode was you went for a long walk, and then you noticed that your legs had started to behave rather oddly.
Yes.
Coordinated. Explain that for me, and what did you make of it at the time?
So at the time, I assumed that I'd simply overexerted myself and I was exhausted. You know, we've all had the experience of going for a long walk and then our legs becoming tired. The difference this time, I suppose, was I'd only walked for 3 or 4 miles, and my legs were becoming not so much tired as heavy. It felt as if I was struggling through concrete, or as if somebody had put a deep sea diver's boots on my feet. And I thought that was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. But then when I started to piece that together with other fragments of evidence, like the fact that I was feeling very weak after having hot baths, or because I would lean my head forward and electric shocks would buzz up and down my spine. Of course, I did some disaster Googling because that's what we all do. And at that stage, I thought maybe I should go and get myself checked out. So I booked in to see my GP. He instantly said, sounds neurological, and then referred me on to a neurologist to be assessed properly.
And you research all those symptoms and give them their names. Regarding this episode of feeling unusually weak after hot baths, you said this was caused by the impaired ability of my demyelinated nerves to conduct electrical impulses after your body temperature rose. Was it important for you to be able to relate your symptoms to what was happening at the nerve level?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, I'm not a medic, and therefore the fragments of knowledge that I've acquired are very much kind of battered by, misunderstanding and by a kind of rumor. However, I did feel I needed to piece together those fragments insofar as I could into some kind of coherent story. Oddly, as my own nerve system started to break apart, I felt the need to find a different way of piecing things together to make sense of it. And what I discovered is that although there are these fairly standard symptoms for MS, which I do talk about in the book, which I suffered and indeed still suffer from, because everybody's experience of the disease is often very slightly different. It means that trying to grasp what MS is and how it will affect you, the individual, does feel like a bit like putting your finger on a blob of mercury and watching it scatter. In some ways, the more you think you understand about it, the more you understand in the abstract what you will only be able to experience in the kind of personal and concrete sense.
And the other thing you talked about later is a bit of a disconnect between what's happening in the nervous system pathologically and what's manifesting outside. How did you manage this disconnect between the two?
I suppose only by trying to learn more about it, and trying to become, I mean, we all become amateur experts in our own pathology when we're diagnosed with something, not least because the models that we're given by the professionals sometimes don't quite fit, like a badly fitting glove, onto our own kind of body. So I just, yeah, whether it was by writing about it, by reading about it, by talking to other people about it, I just felt I needed to arm myself with as much knowledge as possible, while still knowing that knowledge wasn't the same as understanding. I wouldn't necessarily understand what was going on, but at least I might be able to arm myself with a bit more knowledge.
And then the symptoms, I think, progressed rather rapidly. You said they began to thrust themselves center stage. How quickly did it evolve, and were you surprised by that, seeing how your symptoms started quite vaguely?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised. I mean, partly the first few months, I was diagnosed in autumn, and over the next few months, certain symptoms like bladder urgency were clearly getting worse. My walking was getting demonstrably jerkier and more disconnected. I was finding it harder to just deal with ordinary life. Then the summer came, where things became much worse. And we're talking now in July. And as you can tell from the hoarseness of my voice, or the fact that I might look slightly kind of distracted, the summer heat is not my friend, as is not the friend of many people with MS. So yeah, so things gradually are getting worse. And then the more I learnt about the disease, and I was monitoring my own symptoms, I realized that MS could be a little bit like, there's a very good description of bankruptcy by Ernest Hemingway, the novelist, where he says bankruptcy happens very slowly and then very quickly.
Okay.
And MS can be a little bit like that as well. When it comes to progressive MS, which is what I have, it can happen very slowly, but then suddenly it can happen very quickly when you realize you can no longer do something which you'd taken for granted.
And you talked about the urinary urgency, which came on relatively later in the course. You said, I realized that I needed a pee shortly after I started to walk home. And it was a disastrous episode, wasn't it? You had to pee into a bush. Was that kind of a trigger that I need to see someone about what's going on?
Well, no, I'd already seen my GP. I'd already been diagnosed. By that stage, I already knew what the problem was. It was certainly the point at which I realized I needed to, for instance, get myself medicated with a drug. I take a pill of a drug called mirabegron, which helps with urinary urgency. And that was the point at which I realized that, I suppose, even though I knew in the abstract there is no cure for MS, that it's simply individual symptoms that can be managed, that was the first time I realized here was a symptom I really had to manage, because otherwise I was going to be living next to a toilet for the next 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I can see why you highlighted that symptom. And then it came to, I mean, you had the test and then you were given the diagnosis. You said it was done in a brisk, professional manner. The doctor looked you in the eye and just said, I'm going to come right out with it. I think you have MS. Did you half expect the diagnosis, and did you find that brusque attitude kind of the best way to deliver the diagnosis?
I think so. I mean, a little bit later in the book, I describe what Susan Sontag calls the kingdom of the sick, as being one which has very few maps when it comes to MS and just a few hastily kind of scratched out signposts. nobody really knows much about it. You're a neurologist, you're an expert. Even you don't really know that much about MS.
I confess.
No, and it's one. It is. The brain is still the most mysterious of the organs, and neurological disorders, because of the way in which they unpredictably seem to kind of mutate and develop themselves, are the most mysterious of all. So what I didn't want then was someone who's going to hold my hand as we explored this mysterious new world together, sort of cooing and ahhing and, patting my kind of head sort of sympathetically. What I needed was someone who's going to be very kind of upfront about the situation, be honest in terms of how little she could do or anyone could do, and then let me go away and sort of get used to the idea myself. So no, for me, it was helpful, but I can understand that some other people might well want a more kind of touchy-feely or sort of gently approach.
Yeah, a lot is made in medicine about how to break bad news, and papers have been written on that. But you're quite right, is to find out what an individual really wants and go along with that. And your neurologist was surprised that you are so accepting of the diagnosis. Was that a form of denial? Were you trying to kind of not become emotional? Was it fatalistic, pragmatic?
Two reasons, really. One is that, well, three reasons maybe. One is that from the limited research I'd done, I had discovered that progressive MS could progress very slowly. So therefore, it seemed to me that having a reaction that would be outraged or kind of overwhelmed would be too much too soon. The second reason, which is related to that, is that almost all websites which I consulted were almost relentlessly upbeat and chirpy when it came to MS stories. And hey, it's fine. Look, lead a full and active life, and it'll barely affect you at all, and it'll all be absolutely marvelous. Which I may have been a little bit seduced by early on, much less later, but early on I might have been seduced by. And the third reason, I suppose, is that I'd never really thought of my body and myself as being the same. I can imagine things happening to my body so long as my mind, the bit of me that was thinking and therefore writing, teaching, was unaffected. I could cope with my body sort of gradually falling into disrepair, falling apart. It was only later I realized that, in fact, you can't divide up the body and the self like an orange in its skin, not least because the brain that might well have, holes being punched in it through MS is also, of course, the same brain which you're using to think and write with, in my own case. So again, perhaps overly optimistic at the start, more realistic later on.
Part of your narrative contained a lot of humor. One was when you labeled Steppage Gate as if it's a whole bunch of strangers I'd been sharing my house with had decided to come over and introduce themselves to me. How much did you resort to humor to deal with your illness?
Yeah, I mean, when my friends have talked to me about this book, I've described it to them as a slapstick misery memoir. Okay. The misery memoir bit is obvious, but the slapstick bit is because I've often found it easier to think of, for instance, me falling over, tripping over my own feet, falling over, as a kind of clowning rather than something which is a disaster or a miniature daily tragedy. And of course, it's not clowning, because clowns do things deliberately and they bounce back for more of the same, as if their bodies are made of rubber, and they don't really seem to visibly bruise or bleed. And I do both. My arms, even now, are kind of a patchwork of bruises from some more recent falls. However, in terms of attitude, I did find that adopting that response gave me some measure of control over what otherwise I would have no control over. And it allowed me to look at it with a sense of proportion, because as I say in the book, I think a sense of proportion and a sense of humor are often versions of the same thing.
That's interesting. And then talking about steppage gate, you also mentioned many of the other labels that we use, Uthoff's phenomenon, limit sign. Did you find these labels helpful in understanding what's going on, or did you think they muddied the waters?
No, I mean, they gave an element of clarity, and I suppose familiarity as well. Nietzsche, the philosopher, has a very famous line in one of his books where he says, I've given a name to my pain and I've called it dog.
Okay.
And what he's getting at, I think, is that naming something can be the first step to understanding it, to giving it a label, giving it a cognitive shape, means it's then more open to being looked at from different angles and understood. And I felt the same things about Ulhoff's phenomenon, limit sign, or all the other things which are standard sort of tick box exercises in a neurological textbook. And again, I'm not a neurologist. I would never be able to understand the kind of biomedical kind of mechanics of what was going on. But I did find it useful to be able to say, oh, I've had another episode of X or Y.
That's good. Neurologists and medical students do like these names to kind of evoke specific symptoms.
Well, but again, for neurology, but because, as I said earlier, because it is still a very mysterious field of research, of study, of practice. Again, it gives perhaps sometimes the illusion of more control than there is. When you name it, you feel as if you're tapping into a history and into a body of acquired and shared knowledge, which the individual experience of an individual patient might not fully support, precisely because it is such a mysteriously capricious and particular disease.
Interesting. Haven't thought about that perspective before. You referred to Susan Sontag and the concept of the kingdom of the sick. And one of the things I got was it's full of uncertainties and poor knowledge and predictability. How did you navigate through this kingdom of with the uncertainties and unpredictability?
Yeah, I suppose like anyone else in this situation, with a mixture of planning and improvisation. The planning comes because you realize that your world is inevitably shrinking. The circumference of your world shrinks if you can't walk as far as you used to be able to do, for instance, or you can't physically get to places you could once get to. So therefore, your diary shrinks as well. So a lot of that involves planning, knowing what you can do, what you can't do, which invitations you can accept, which ones you have to reluctantly decline, or as happened last week when I went to London for somebody's party, it involved a huge amount of planning of taxis and coaches and being met with wheelchairs and making sure there was accessibility and where the toilets were. Toilets, that's the most important thing. Anyone with an MS will tell you the thing you learn more quickly than anything else is where are the toilets. Wherever you go, the first thing you do is scope out where the toilets are. And that, again, it's planning, but also improvisation as well.
And before you developed MS, you're kind of ignorant about this kingdom of the sick. And you talked about a colleague who had recently died, who was on a wheelchair, and you kind of regretted this blind spot when it came to those living in the kingdom of the sick. Does this evoke a kind of guilt, regret?
Both.
Both.
But in fact, regret and guilt are very often images of each other, aren't they? It was a reflection of the fact that I had always thought of him as being physically proximate, but in other ways out of touch of me. And this is what happens with those in the kingdom of the sick, that we are often all around those in the kingdom of the well, and yet we seem to be living in a different dimension from them. This odd way in which these two worlds can collide, rub up against each other, as if the two citizens of these two countries have nothing to say to each other. Just as I would not avoid my colleague, but I didn't see any point of contact with him. And again, one of the reasons for writing my book and hoping it's going to be read by more than just people who have or care for those with MS is to try and allow for border crossings between those two kingdoms, or make us realize we all have two passports. As Susan Sontag says, we all have a passport to the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick, and we have to recognize those passports are often interchangeable.
There's this idea that the best doctors are those who themselves have experienced illness. I suspect even doctors kind of live in a different world than their patients, and
I'm sure that's right. But particularly when it comes to treating with the absolutely kind of accurate, rigorous, dispassionate kind of expertise that a good doctor will have. It's very easy, perhaps, for that to topple over into indifference. So you can be dispassionate but still be understanding.
And if you were to go back, how would you have related to your colleague with the benefit of hindsight? In other words, how should people in the kingdom of the well, would you advise them to relate to those who have disability?
Yeah, I suppose I would have been more prepared to listen if he wanted to talk to me about it, to have been silent if he didn't, to have not assumed he wanted help and therefore bullied him into accepting it, but at the same time being open to a non-judgmental kind of help if he'd chosen to ask me for it. I suppose generally just being more open to the idea that I could have recognized both his differences from me then, but also our commonalities, and being aware of how permeable that line is between the two.
Some physicians have written about the need for people with chronic illnesses to have their illness witnessed. Just the fact that someone is witnessing it makes kind of a big difference. I suspect that's what.
That's right. It's very well put. Yes.
One of the disturbing aspects of suffering with MS, which you described, was how it makes each patient question the kind of story they're in, and that story, that questioning, kind of gets more as the disease progresses. Can you explain that phenomenon of questioning the story? What did you mean?
Sure. So I suppose what I meant is that when we all think about ourselves, our lives, we try to piece together fragments of experience, like our memories and our desires and our friendships and all the kind of bits that make us us. We try to piece them together into a coherent narrative, which we call our life story. A bit like bits of Lego, which we sort of piece together until they look like something like the picture on the box. There are lots of stories around MS, some of which I talk about in my book. So there are tragedies like the film Harry and Jackie, which is about the cellist Jacqueline Dupre I mentioned earlier. There are also lots of weird sort of pot-boiling romances in which people with MS end up having these kind of wild love affairs with passages of thumping sex, which is a sort of narrative wish fulfillment, I suppose. But what MS does, it seems to me, is it makes you question the kind of story you're in, because it's not just that your nerves are kind of flaking and shredding. It's that your understanding of yourself starts to fall apart as well. And then what you have to do is try to piece your life together, the fragments that remain, into a slightly different shape, which I suppose is another reason why I was writing my book, to see what kind of narrative shape I could make out of these fragments once they'd sort of fallen to the ground.
As an extension of that, you wrote about how your understanding of your own life fell into disarray, and little by little you became a stranger to yourself. In what ways has MS kind of impacted you socially and professionally?
Well, so socially, as I mentioned earlier, it means I have to monitor my own social diary quite carefully, try to work out what I can do, what I can't do. And luckily I have very understanding friends and family. So they realize that I can't do all the things I would want to do or they would want me to do. It also involves having to make adjustments to my professional life. So I'm lucky enough to work for an Oxford college, which is very good on this phrase, reasonable adjustments. What they can do to make my life kind of as manageable as possible professionally. For instance, they just bought me an electric scooter to help me get around the grounds of the college more easily. So in half an hour, I'm going to be cycling, because I can still cycle, into college. And when I get off my bike, I'll get onto my electric scooter. I'll go to various meetings. I'll get back on my bike and come back home. So there are things that are mitigating things that one can put in place like that. But it does mean that there's sort of the air of ramshackle improvisation that most of us have most days, where we think, oh, what shall I do? Maybe I'll walk up the road. Maybe I'll go and post a letter. Maybe I'll go to the gym. Maybe I'll go out for lunch. No, you can't do any of those things unless they've been carefully planned ahead of time.
So I'm guessing that kind of planning meant you couldn't have been tempted to keep your diagnosis. Well, you wrote about it, but clearly there wasn't any idea, I need to keep my diagnosis a secret. And
Well, I understand why. People in different professions, I absolutely understand why they would want to. Because if you're working in a kind of cutthroat industry where any weakness or any perceived weakness is kind of seized on as an opportunity to pass you over for promotion or sack you or whatever, I can absolutely sympathise with that. Luckily, I'm not. I mean, in some ways, education is another branch of the caring profession, and therefore, it would have been odd for my colleagues, who are also my friends, not to support me. And for that reason, I felt that I could be open and honest with everyone. And also for that reason, I could get any support that I needed later on, whether it was time off or it was equipment or other adjustments. But it is one of those it's a very difficult choice, I think, that people face, particularly when it comes to how far you should be honest and open with loved ones. If you have children, do you explain it to them? If you have, elderly relatives, do you explain it to them? So, yeah, it is tricky.
You turned out to have this primary progressive form of MS, which is by definition progresses over time. And you referred to how the neurologists use this scale, the expanded disability status scale, to measure it. And you referred to this as the MS equivalent of the 4 stages of life of the Sphinx Riddle. I'm a bit ignorant of this. Can you explore that a bit, the Sphinx Riddle?
Yeah, so it's in the classical legend, the Sphinx asks what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening. And the answer, it turns out, is man, because we start off by crawling and then we walk upright and then we might end up with a stick. And the reason I mention that in the book is that the EDSS scale comes with little pictures, which seem to offer kind of versions of that. It just happens that you end up with a stick much earlier than some other people, and you might end up kind of flat on your back at an earlier stage to other people as well. The point is, it's inevitable, but how you reach those various stages, which are themselves very crude and cartoonish representations of people's lived experience, how you reach those things is absolutely unknowable on a case-by-case basis.
Have you found the EDSS relevant to you? I must confess, a lot of neurologists have criticisms of the EDSS. Did it correlate with your illness, do you think?
Well, in some ways and in some ways not. It is, of course, crude and cartoonish. But as a rule of thumb, then I suppose it gives a kind of vague sense of how things might develop. But because it offers a one-size-fits-all model for a disease which is weirdly kind of idiosyncratic, patient by patient, that means that relying on it to gauge how someone is developing and say, well, you've moved from EDSS 2.5 to 3.5 seems to me to be unhelpful.
We use it as well to determine whether somebody is eligible to treatment with the relapsing remitting form, which a lot of patients hate the idea that they've been denied something because they've kind of got a number. The other thing you talked about was how medicine has this paradox of trying to see patients as individuals and yet is forced to put them into categories. Do you think we're managing it well? Do we succeed, or are we failing in?
Well, obviously, this is only one patient's perspective, so take this with a huge handful of salt. But I suppose in my experience, of course, it's not unique to MS. You might think about cancer pathways, for instance, and good doctors. And I've had some very, very good doctors are aware of the limitations of these pathways. And in the NHS, of course, often it's down to a lack of resources, which means that your neurologist will see you for an annual checkup, and in my case, will monitor how things have deteriorated or not deteriorated. But because there are no really effective treatments for primary progressive MS, there is one drug now which has been approved, but it may or may not help a little bit in some cases. It's certainly not a sort of magic bullet for the disease. So in that sense, I suppose, of course, the doctors are doing the best they can with the resources that they've got. But sometimes I do feel that it might be better if they were more open about that, about the fact that they are working with limited information, that they are not gods, that they will do their best with the information they have, but it might not be appropriate or helpful.
Yeah, there's a concept of sharing the uncertainties with the patient, which conflicts with our tradition of being those who know as physicians.
Exactly.
I guess that is changing, hopefully. And even though you had the untreatable, let's put it that way, form of MS, you still searched for treatment, and you came across autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, which you rightly called a tongue twister. What did the treatment entail, and did you get any benefit from it?
Well, this is where I'm very wary of saying too much because you're a medical expert and I'm not. So again, I'll sketch it out in very crude terms. The idea behind it is that if MS is an autoimmune disease in which your nervous system is in essence attacking itself, then by removing the the information, the faulty information, which is causing those responses to happen, then your body might stop reacting in that way. So what that involves in practice is a whopping dose of chemotherapy to essentially wipe out your immune system. Having had your stem cells kind of removed from your body and then frozen, stored, and then the stem cells being reintroduced into your bloodstream, where they then migrate to the bone marrow and start to repopulate it, and therefore build up your immune system in a way which is more innocent and therefore less likely to have that badly programmed response. It should then stop new attacks from happening and either stop or slow down progression of the disease. I went for that even though well, partly because there were no other options, but also, and I'd heard good testimonials from people whose judgment I trusted on how it had helped them, even though they had primary progressive MS. And there is little data, certainly little longitudinal data, on HSCT helping people with primary progressive MS, but good anecdotal evidence and some developing longitudinal studies that suggested that even though it's not as effective as it is for people with relapsing remitting MS, it still could have a benefit. So that's what I decided to do. I had to do it privately because at that stage, it would have taken a very long time for me to be assessed and approved for NHS treatment. And that's what I did. I did in London. And I did it 5 years ago, and I don't regret it.
How are you able to gauge whether any lack of progression is due to the treatment or is just your disease stabilizing?
And it's impossible because we don't have control subjects for ourselves. This is the basic problem. So all you can do is gauge your own responses to the treatment against the measurable data of other patients in a similar but not identical situation, and then weigh up your own situation before and during and after and come to a sort of reasoned conclusion. So in my case, after 5 years, my walking is now, I would say, demonstrably worse than it was 5 years ago. And it's getting worse. But I don't have any new symptoms. The other symptoms which I had before are absolutely rock solid stable. So in my case, I'd say it's been a qualified success. The key thing I was terrified about was developing brain lesions that would affect my ability to think or would cause well, cognitive decline or the kind of crushing exhaustion that some people with MS suffer from. And I haven't developed any of those things yet. Would they have remained stable without the treatment? I don't know. I will never know. But it seemed to be at least a shot worth taking.
Probably not. I think we have to assume it probably would have gotten worse without the treatment.
Well, it was expensive, so I hope so.
One of the things about your book is that there are a lot of references to literature, which is kind of understandable being a professor of literature. And one reason you gave for citing literature was that we all tend to understand our lives through stories. Did you find that literature helped you to understand your own condition? Did it make you feel any less isolated?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, all of us who read, we go to books to feel less alone. We go to books to discover models for ourselves or alternatives to our lives. They let us slip on other people's skins, try them on for size. They let us refract our own lives, like looking at a kaleidoscope and twisting it and seeing our own lives being reflected back at us in different patterns. So to that extent, yes, I'd always use books for those reasons. And I found a new reason to do that with MS, because either old books which have nothing to do with MS, like Jeeves and Wooster, I talk about in the book as being immensely helpful when your own life is changing radically and uncontrollably, to find a fictional world where everything stays reassuringly exactly the same, book after book, story after story, year after year, decade after decade. I found that very helpful. But also going back to some of my favorite writers and realizing that their works did look different in the light of my experiences. So I talk about a play which I acted in when I was a teenager by Samuel Beckett called Krapp's Last Tape, in which an old man, and I played the old man when I was 17, with a lot of aging makeup. The old man sort of walks around with a laborious walk, as it's described, with a cracked and hoarse voice, and he worries about his bowel movements, and his memory seems to be going. You know, all of which seem to be a world away from my experience as a 17-year-old. Now I look back and I think, oh my God, no, it's not that this character has MS, but I can absolutely see to refracted versions of my own experience in this character.
It's surprising how much fiction is very close to reality when you look into it deeply. And the book that had the most impact on you was Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, which you used as the title of your own book. And you wrote that you had not been able to shake out of your head the image of a beetle lying on its back with its legs waving feebly in the air. I haven't read Metamorphosis, but I assume that comes from the book. What was it about this image that struck you? And what was it about the book that made you take the title?
So the story, it's a novella by Kafka, which begins with a traveling salesman called Gregor Samsa waking up and realizing he's been transformed overnight into a giant insect. It's never explained why or how. It's simply presented as a fact, a fait accompli. And then the rest of the story deals with the horrified reactions of his family in the flat where he lives with them, and a work colleague who comes to visit and is shooed away, and the maid. And what happens that over time, he's gradually more and more isolated and abandoned, and he basically starves to death and is swept up by the maid and thrown out with the rest of the daily rubbish. Now, so in some ways, it's a kind of horrible allegory for what someone who has a kind of life-changing illness might well fear is going to happen to them. You have this transformation in your life. It will affect those around you as much as you. You will be first cared for, then neglected, then abandoned. And in my case, I suppose it also spoke to the love I've always had of transformation, whether it's my own experiments with, makeup and loving David Bowie as a teenager, or reading superhero comics, or more recently writing books about people like Lewis Carroll, who in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland has Alice go through a whole series of physical transformations. So Metamorphosis, I chose as the title because it seems to be a helpful kind of bracket within which to think about the changes that happen to a lot of people over time. And also I chose it because, as the designer realized in her book design, it's a word that begins with M and ends with S, metamorphosis. So it seemed to be helpful.
Okay, I missed that. Okay, and the other book you've already mentioned was The Journal of a Disappointed Man, which you said would prove to be an important turning point in how I approached my own situation. Tell me a bit more about this.
Yeah, so Bruce Cummings, the young naturalist who wrote it, called his book A Study in the Nude, by which he meant that he wanted to describe his experiences with a kind of brutal honesty. And he does, particularly as his disease gets worse and he is bedridden and can only experience life through a window. However, as well as that, even those dreadful last few months of his life are described in a way which is full of passages of lyrical beauty. So you have both the pain and the pleasure of life being brought together in a single piece of writing. And it means that then, even at the moments where Cummings wonders if he would be better off dead, what his writing does is spark into life and makes you appreciate the way that you too can look at the world, that makes it too spark into life. So that's why it was important for me, not only as a sort of guide for the path that I might be going down, but also a sort of template for how I might respond to it.
So it kind of serves as a counterbalance to Kafka, was it? A bit...
In some ways, though, Cummings is even more brutal than Kafka. But he recognizes the mixture of feelings we might have about disease. The fact that we might feel despairing and self-disgusted in one breath, and oddly grateful and happy in another breath.
The other book which I would like to kind of explore is Peter Pan, which you said led you to contemplate suicide as an escape from disease. Does that mean your exploration of literature kind of had a dark side to it in that sense?
I would say so. I mean, Pan is the character who thinks that death would be an awfully big adventure. And yes, at the time of my diagnosis, it's not that it depressed me. It's not that I wanted to kill myself, but in the way that I was planning ahead to possible futures, possible alternative futures. One future would be that my disease took hold very quickly. It got worse and worse. I became incapacitated. I had to give up the job that I love. Life became unendurable. And I would then go to Dignitas in Switzerland. Absolutely. That seems to be an entirely reasonable kind of bit of forward planning. Are things at that stage now? No. Might they be at some stage in the future? Well, maybe. Peter Pan, though, of course, is a story in which the main character never grows up and is invulnerable because it's a stage play, and therefore Pan can always be replaced by another actor playing the same role. The difference is that we can't be. So therefore, we have to take these things a little more seriously.
I've read accounts where people feel knowing that they have the option of ending it all actually makes them carry on. Did you?
Yeah, I can absolutely understand that. Yes, that knowing that there is a door open means you're less likely to want to walk through it. That's absolutely the case.
A lot of themes, and if we had more time, we'll probably explore a bit more. We've talked about all the lessons, or a lot of lessons you want to pass on. Are there any other ones we haven't talked on, which you think your readers should take away from the book?
I suppose, I mean, the three most obvious ones, which we probably touched on already. One is carpe diem, seize the day. Don't put things off because you simply don't know when you won't be able to do things. The second is don't feel embarrassed to think about putting yourself in someone else's skin and imagining what it's like to be them and asking them if you don't know. And the third thing, of course, is to realize that one of the easiest ways of doing that without having to embarrass yourself in front of your friends is by reading a book, because reading a book is the easiest way of slipping into someone else's life and seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
The next question may not be fair, but if you can answer that, what are the major questions or uncertainties in the field of MS from your perspective?
Well, I'm just a lowly patient. I'm not a researcher or an expert. However, it seems to me that most of the research so far has been about preventing further attacks, particularly in relapsing remitting MS. Very little attention has been paid to making patients better. It's been about not making them worse. So I think that more research focus on remyelination is what's really needed. In other words, repairing the kind of fatty sheaths around the nerves, which are gradually ruptured and flaking away through the course of somebody's MS.
Well, for you MS researchers out there, that's a task for you to take up. And what do you think the immediate and long-term futures hold for MS? Do you think that?
Well, I mean, immediately that there is the large study, the STAR MS trial, which is going on at the moment. They're still, I think, recruiting patients for that. The idea of that is to compare the efficacy of the best drugs against HSCT as alternative or complementary therapies. So that will be very helpful, very interesting. It might also help to break down some of the taboos around HSCT. There are still, I think, some neurologists who think of it as too risky or unproven, and are therefore reluctant to put patients forward for it, and instead would rather stick to drugs which do have a kind of a longer history, a longer track record of success. But it might be that if the trial data come back and HSCT is thought to be a better intervention that is done earlier rather than later, then that I think will be very helpful.
And the concept of starting stronger treatments early is actually taking ground in MS as well. So hopefully that's
precisely. I think that my understanding is that up till now, particularly patients at an early stage of the disease, there's been reluctance to go in too heavily with anything that might have major side effects, and instead it's been sort of gently. And then, of course, when things get worse, the big guns are wheeled out. But then by then, often it's too late.
Okay. What projects are you working on at the moment? Are you writing a book?
I am. So, ironically, well, not ironically, appropriately, given what we've been talking about, I'm writing a book about how to read at the moment, which will be coming out in about a year and a half's time. So, yes, how to get more out of books is what I'm looking at the moment.
Okay, I'll be keen to lay my hands on that. Do let us know when it comes out. And on the theme of books, are there any other books you would recommend, either on any theme, brain, MS, literature?
Well, one of them we've touched on already, which is The Journal of a Disappointed Man, by under the pen name W.P.N. Barbellion. You can get hold of it online or in Penguin Classics. It's a life-changing in the sense of it's about someone's life changing, but I think for many people who read it, it's also life-changing. Secondly, I would say those who are interested in the larger history of MS as a disease, there's a good history by someone called T. Jock Murray, called Multiple Sclerosis, The History of a Disease, which goes into the disease in a lot of detail, including all the various crazy treatments that were tried in the past, electrifying your scalp and using leeches and all the rest. And the third thing I'd recommend is nothing to do with MS, but just in terms of making us realize what a strange organ the brain is and how little we know about it. A book that many neurologists already know, which is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, by Oliver Sacks, full of stories about the brain and just how mysterious those few square inches between our ears really is.
Well, I will second Jock Murray. I cited him in the monologue I did for MS, so I second that. Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful. And to my audience, either watching or listening, thank you for your time. And if you found the podcast enlightening, and after you've read Robert's book, you might want to check mine called Surfing the Brain. And for more academic neurology, I have a website called Neuro Checklist. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, consider subscribing to the iTunes, Apple, YouTube, or Spotify channels. But until then, thank you very much for your time. And Robert, thank you very much for sparing your time for this podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.